Ah, yes, the 90s, the 90s, the 90s, the 90s. The 90s are coming at you here on Radness Rewind. Hello, Retro Red Wes. And this is going to be something a little bit different, but I'm going to start doing more of this. This is going to be kind of like a off the cuff thing, no scripting, none of that. It's just going to be me talking. Something about from anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes each episode of Radness Rewind. But it's going to be me kind of just looking back at things. And today I want to talk about the 90s, something that was very special for me and a lot of millennials. I was born in '89, south of Atlanta, East Point, grew up in North Georgia in a place called Dawsonville. And, my childhood was good for the most part. There was a lot of hard times here and there. And you can maybe say that sometimes it wasn't very typical. I was raised by my dad, single dad, raising me and my sister. So our life was definitely very different. And, the 90s for me were pretty much everything. And I can kind of remember the smells and the tastes of the 90s very vividly. And I will say, growing up for me in the 90s, I definitely heavily relied on entertainment to kind of keep me going sometimes because, I grew up autistic and not everybody knows about me, but I'm actually very autistic. And so I used entertainment to kind of distract me from some of the lesser, you know, things in my life that are really bothered me. Those things seem to be just things that I didn't really like very much. And so for me, I guess growing up in the 90s, I just enjoyed the entertainment. It seems like nowadays I don't really enjoy things like I used to back then. Behind me here, I use this background because this background right here kind of represents, everything I loved about the 90s. I used to read Goosebumps books all the time when I was a kid. And y'all probably know this because you watched a lot of my stuff. And one of the things I want to say about this type of format I'm going to be doing for future videos like this is like 10 to 15 minutes is I'm going to try not to edit as much as I can. I want it to be raw. I also don't want to throw a bunch of flashy like stuff on top of it. It's just me talking to you guys, sort of like one on one. I want y'all to relate to this. I want you to comment, tell me about your experiences growing up in the 90s. I honestly believe that the 90s was the last great decade before things just started really going downhill. And I think a lot of the music, the movies, um, just the pop culture at the time was just really awesome. We were very optimistic about the future in the late 90s. That Gen X softcore look that they used to do for a lot of advertisements kind of projected that we were very optimistic about the future. And I was too. I thought I was going to have everything that my parents had, my dad, especially. My mom kind of came in and out of my life for a long time until I turned about 11. And then she was more permanent in my life. And, I spent a lot of times with my dad working on job sites at 5 years old back in the 90s. And I'm pretty sure if people did that with their kids now and they got caught, they'd get in a lot of trouble. I don't know. I don't know how things are now, but that's what it was like for me growing up. Was working with my dad a lot, working with my hands. So honestly, I can honestly say that growing up back then definitely taught me a lot about work ethic. And I'm definitely very thankful for that. I'm very thankful to my dad. And I'm very thankful that I grew up in North Georgia. You know, it could have been worse. I could have grown up in worse ways for sure. And I got to give a shout out to my grandparents back in the 90s. They really stepped it up and really helps me, become who I am today. I owe my grandmother so much, because she's the reason why I became a filmmaker. Because in the 90s, she used to take me and show me all these different movies, which was really cool. And when my mom would come around and I would go with my mom, I got to give her some credit because my love for horror movies and just classic movies from back in the day, like in the '80s, I kinda definitely got that from my mom, and I'm very thankful for that because she would just take me to the video store. My dad would do this sometimes too. I'd go up to one of the racks, and I'd be like, "Oh, wow, what is this? Killer Clowns from Outer Space or Troll or, Street Trash or Puppet Master?" All these, like, really crazy movies that I probably shouldn't have been watching as a kid, but I watched it anyway. And that was the '90s to me. I could still picture I can still remember the smell, the taste of that, walking in those old video rental stores. And what a time that was, really, back in the 90s. We were literally in a small little sliver of time before that stuff was gonna come to an end, because by the time I was getting out of high school in 2007, that stuff was pretty much out the door, and it was on its way out. And I didn't even know at the time because Netflix came about a year later, and that was kinda it. A lot of us were just more interested in saying, "Oh, how can we find these things online?" Because 'Cause we'd already been downloading them illegally, through uTorrent and all kinds of other stuff. Remember the LimeWire days with the music? I'm sure y'all remember that, I do. But we're talking about the '90s. Let's not focus on the 2000s because I will do a video about that. We'll get to that. So back in the '90s, I do remember everything looked a lot more vivid. I do remember things popped a lot more. And it seems like nowadays colors are a lot more dull. Maybe that just comes with age, you know? I remember reading Goosebumps books back in the day at home, during the summer, during the fall. I remember that smell. I remember the smell of my dad cooking food downstairs, on a Saturday or Sunday, like late afternoon. I remember the breeze coming through the window. I remember the smell of the autumn air out there. And I remember my dad making the most delicious beef spare ribs ever. Broccoli with cheese, Parmesan, butter. Delicious. Full baked potato. I also remember the smell of the Goosebumps book I was reading at the time. I think at the time it was Beast from the East. Good book, by the way. Check it out if you've ever read that book. It just, it was a magical time. And honestly, I owe a lot of who I am to experiencing those things back then. And I'll be honest with you, I would never trade it for anything in the world. One thing that kind of comes to mind too was our summers back then. It's summertime right now. And I remember just eating fresh cold watermelon from the cooler, or that sandwich that you would just load up with Doritos or something, maybe regular chips. I like Doritos, and I'd crush the sandwich and I'd eat that thing. Had the cold cuts on there, the gabagool. Love that stuff. It was so good. It was so fantastic. I remember having a Super Soaker, 1000. That thing was the jam. I used to tear kids up with that thing. I remember the smell of like, suntan lotion and sunblock. We had that colored sunblock that we'd put on our faces, and I definitely remember the vivid smell of that. Being at the neighborhood pool, all these kids running around acting like clowns, and if we got out of line, we definitely got an ass whooping. There was no denying that. What a time it was, though. And I would never trade it for anything in the world. Because, to be honest with you, I'm really glad I had an analog childhood. I'm glad I got to play Doom, Duke Nukem, Diablo, all these different computer games on our family computer. Games I probably shouldn't have been playing, but I did anyway. And we stayed outside all day. We literally wouldn't come back during the summer till you know, like 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And it was crazy that we were left unsupervised for so long. And me and my sister would get into so much trouble. We'd go out in the woods, we'd build forts, we'd destroy things. And, there's a lot of times that we did things we probably should have really gotten in trouble for. We used to do the same thing in my grandparents' house, my dad's parents. We used to go to their house and go out back and do crazy stuff. But I remember being in my grandparents' house in the summer, we would also watch a lot of Ed, and Eddie and stuff like that. Remember Ed, and Eddie? Man, love that stuff back in the day. And it just really was a time that was very, very, very fun for most people who grew up during that time period. We had a lot of freedom. There was none of this like, oh, I'm worried about my kids walking a couple of feet from my house type stuff. It was, you went out on an epic adventure, and that was it. And you came back because it made you tough. Our go-karts didn't have roll cages on them most of the time. Me and my sister had these two go-karts. They didn't have a roll cage. When you rolled over on that thing, you're lucky if you survived it, but we did because we lived it and we were tough. We were so tough. And I remember during the summer, getting those really crazy sunburns because kids are really bad about putting sunblock on and keeping it on. I don't like that as an adult. I make sure I keep that stuff on because I want my skin to last a long time. I'm almost 40 years old, 37 years old, but I still don't look like it yet. Like, I don't look as old as my dad did when he was 37. No offense, Dad. It's just they lived harder than we did in a lot of ways. They went harder than we did sometimes too, you know? 'Cause they didn't think about things, and a lot of them used to smoke a lot. My generation doesn't smoke as much as they did, and I hear the Gen Z doesn't really smoke at all. Maybe they do like the vapes, but yeah, 90s summers were always so good. Those hot dogs and hamburgers just really hit, when the lightning bugs were out and the fire was roaring, keeping the stupid ass mosquitoes away. You don't really see lightning bugs as much as you used to. There's got to be something to that. And then I also think about different times of the year in the 90s. Like, I remember how excited we were in spring, right? Spring break, we were excited to go do something. And usually it would be us going, and staying at home most of the time. But sometimes we go somewhere cool up in the mountains, because we're close by the mountains. We were in that area, North Georgia. And then, like in the fall, Halloween was always a jam. It was always a thing. I loved Halloween. I always had so much fun during Halloween. In my neighborhood in Dawsonville, we always went all out during Halloween. I literally one time did the full prosthetic makeup with Freddy Krueger when I was about 8 years old. And it looked really cool. And my dad helped me with it. I mean, props to my dad. He really wanted me and my sister to have a good Halloween. It was just so wonderful. That shit really hurt on my face, though. It was like that spirit gum got really stuck on there. And I didn't know what it was called at the time because, I didn't know a lot of these terms. But I was very thankful for that. I was very thankful for that experience. And we had a lot of neighbors that would build these elaborate haunted houses. And I don't even know if they do that anymore. Let me know down below. Do they still do that? Because I don't think so. And I'm also thinking about how my grandparents would come over around the same time and they'd bring us a giant bag of candy, a lot of sugar, probably not too good for us, but we killed it anyway. And then I remember as I got a little bit older in the late 90s, when I became more of an older kid, me and my buddy Destin and my buddy Murphy, we would go in my neighborhood and go trick or treating on our own. And I remember this one time went to this guy's house. He had this whole elaborate haunted house where they had monsters in the woods. They were doing like a little haunted hayride. I think he was using his lawnmower to push like a giant like trailer with it, which is kind of weird. And I remember we went through this haunted hayride thing and they had like s- like monsters everywhere. They had Chucky on the ground, stuff, all kinds of weird shit like that. And I remember one time, me and my buddy Destin accidentally busted a couple of, you know, pumpkins. Not intentionally, of course, but we did that, and I do feel bad about that. You know, Mr. Jargon, I'm sorry for breaking your pumpkins. It was an accident, but we ran for our lives because we didn't want to get in trouble. Yeah, it was definitely a good time. We had this place called Bert's Pumpkin Farm, and we used to go get pumpkins there too. Our school would take us on field trips there during the fall, and we used to do the hay rides. We used to eat like slices of pumpkin pie and all these really cool things, and we'd get to pick out a pumpkin. We'd carve that pumpkin at home. God, it was so much fun. So analog, there was no like internet back then. All we had was dial up, you know. Some people had, probably faster internet if they had, like, a nice job, but most of us, it was either no internet or dial-up. My dad had dial-up in the '90s, and I think he mostly had it for his job because sometimes he had to be on the internet. But it's just crazy to think that back then, that all these different times, throughout the seasons, we got to experience these really cool things about the '90s, and maybe everybody's experienced that with their childhood, but I feel like the '90s were just so much different because it was so analog. This is before people cared about all this BS about being an influencer on social media. Social media started with my generation, in 2005 with, MySpace. And if you really want to be technical about it, before then they had stuff like Friendster and Zanga and stuff like that. But it wasn't as popular. is MySpace. MySpace really set the tone for it. And sometimes I wish we could go back to MySpace. But one thing I will say about the 90s too is things were just more affordable. My dad bought his house, where we lived for really, really cheap. And it's ridiculous how cheap it was. He spent $80,000 in the early 90s on our house. And I just looked at it the other day and they said it's worth almost $500,000. There's no way. I mean, $500,000 for that house? It's a decent house, I'll give him that, but it ain't worth that much. And what's crazy is for millennials, I think one of the biggest things that bothers us is back in the 90s, there was so much affordability and now there's just not, right? I know we're always thinking about it. Groceries are high. Gas is so high right now. I just bought gas today. It was $4 a gallon. And the wages really just haven't kept up with it. A lot of us are very underpaid and we can't afford to buy a house. And our parents in the 90s were able to buy these houses. And it's just so sad that a lot of us may not even get that. And, I know a lot of people are going to come on here and be like, well, you just got to work harder. Or you just didn't do things right. No, I think most people did things right. Millennials, we worked hard. We just want what our parents had access to. We're not asking for a handout. We just want to have the same affordability they had in the 90s, and it just doesn't exist anymore. So now we're expected to work ourselves to death to be able to afford just a little bit, just a small little percentage of what they had. And I don't think that's acceptable, you know? And maybe that's why we're so nostalgic for the 90s because we know that they were able to afford those things. You know, and for me, I'll never trade that for anything in the world, my experience growing up in the 90s. But sometimes I wish we could just go back to the way things used to be. And can we just try to have things be affordable again? Can we try to go back to when, you know, Americans could have a middle class? Because the middle class is disappearing. It really is. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to get political on you guys. It's just, it doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on. Things are just not good right now. And I really feel bad seeing people suffer. And I know a lot of people feel this way. But one thing I will say, growing up in the 90s, I love watching Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, all those shows made me who I am. Are You Afraid of the Dark? Goosebumps, it's made me the person I am and why I love really campy like movies. It's my jam and it's always going to be my jam. And no matter what I do, I'm always going to like that stuff. And I'm really happy that I got to experience it. I miss my grandparents a lot. Thanks, Dad, for, you know, keeping a roof over our head and working so hard. I know you worked a lot of long hours, and sometimes we spent a lot of time by ourselves. We had to learn how to do adult things very young. And I'm very thankful that my grandparents helped out when they could. Thanks, Mom, for introducing me to a lot of the movies I like now. Letting me just pick those things out. It definitely really helped a lot. And I'm very thankful that you know, I didn't become the person I thought I was gonna be. Back in the 90s, I thought I was gonna be this fucking bum, I was gonna be this guy who wasn't worth a shit, but thankfully, I went to college, I got my degree, and I got the career I wanted. I work in film, or I do marketing videos for a company, and I do this, YouTube, and hopefully one day, I'll be directing, feature films that you guys will enjoy. And I really appreciate you guys, for supporting me and watching me. And I'm also very thankful for the lot of things that I have in my life that I've worked hard for. A lot of this stuff I've gotten myself. At the end of the day, though, I wish I didn't have all the debt that came with a lot of that stuff. And I wish people would have taught us better back then. But now we know better. And now our kids are going to know not to make the same mistakes we did. So here's to the 90s. Hope you guys have a good one. This one's for the 90s. I'm going to do this format a lot more often. I think it's really cool to just kind of do like a talking head video. And, got good visuals in the back. Everybody have like a cold drink. That's all you can really ask for. Hopefully we'll make it through this stuff. I'm very thankful. So Here's to the 90s, and here's to the future. Hopefully it'll be better. Thanks, guys. Hey, Retro Red West here. Thanks for checking out my content. Retro Red West on all major platforms, social media, what have you. New content dropping every Monday at 3 p.m. and sometimes on Fridays. And new clips every day on my social media platforms.